What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Clarke Notes. First thing off here today, PSA, do not write on other people's vehicles when you see that they're dirty. I'm not sure who did it, but someone kind of just went and wrote "wash me" on my truck, and the letters are still very much pronounced in there, and had to go get some work done there today, and it wasn't very fun. So with the spring, don't touch anyone else's vehicle. It is not worth it. My main intention almost always is to try and find ways to make education a little less uneasy than it needs to be. And I think for the previous few episodes with Conrad Drover, I think him and I would have talked about this on the last episode as well of Clarke Notes, where I think him and I are both kind of moving toward the same goal of trying to talk about self-improvement, but not necessarily in like, oh, if you run 38 miles a day, then all of your problems will magically be solved. I know for myself, I've been very much a David Goggins and Cameron Haynes fan over the past like 5, 6 years. I remember I ran a marathon, ran a half marathon. Conrad's ran several half marathons in his life, but I think him and I are trying to kind of break through that new barrier of wondering what podcasting looks like now that this kind of initial phase of 2 to 5 years has kind of gone through. And almost every podcast that's popular kind of is about the same thing. Now, true crime is kind of its own thing, but I think keeping the education at the forefront here and trying to talk about, again, even connection, but not in a cheesy way. And I'll kind of share a bit more about that of something I'm thinking of working on, what it looks like, a timeline that I might have for that, and so forth. Mr. Clarke After Dark is brought to you by Luxy. That's Luxy. Luxy is the standard for modern dating as it gives you a greater understanding of any potential match's intentions and background before you make your move. Swiping endlessly in other dating apps can be exhausting and often leave you with only the leftovers in your dating pool. Luxy is an exclusive platform with just a 10 to 15% acceptance rate, as well as a profile and income verification feature so you can be confident you're only connecting with those who meet your high standards. The community guidelines emphasize safety, trust, and equality by strictly prohibiting scams, explicit content, and harassment. 2025 is your year to stop settling. With Luxy, there is no luck involved, just real connections with people who truly match what it is you are looking for. Download the Luxy app today to see if you qualify for a better chance at finding the right person for you. And now, back to the show. So, with Conrad's episode there, I really think the one thing that sticks out to me all the time is like, what is it you're trying to do? I think it's not very fun to kind of pinhole yourself into kind of one type of thing. So, trying to kind of bring on a variety of guests, like I think the neuroscience field is still interesting to me, even though for the most part, the way neuroscience applies to education is always very fickle. And what I mean by that is people will say, oh, like the learning behind, like the neuroscience of learning is, oh, like give your kid brain breaks and make sure they get more time outside, which no one actually listens to. And, oh, like you just have to be there and listen for your kids when they're trying to open up to you. Okay, like we're doing all these things, but nothing is really improving for the better. So I think kind of trying to take everything that you hear at the grand scale with a grain of salt and actually go a bit further and trying to maybe not even create new questions, but I guess wondering how the questions we've actually been asking actually apply to what we're trying to accomplish. And even that, like what are we trying to accomplish in the classroom? I know a lot of my middle school students recently have discovered the Mr. Clarke After Dark podcast, and I think even if any of them are listening, it's always just remember that we are doing everything we can to try and figure out what it is you need, and we don't have all the answers, even though we've asked the questions so many times. So yeah, what is the podcast about? What should you expect to see from this kind of moving forward? I do think the next, or like even kind of what's already been going on in the past few weeks and the next few weeks with the podcast here, the past few episodes I had, obviously Conrad on, and then Amy Marshall, who I think a big theme that kind of comes up in teaching, and I think a lot of people in life, is that there's really a big distinction of like what is it that you want to do with your life versus like how much money do you want to make in your life. Now, I might even just kind of be going into the rabbit hole here of what every podcast goes into. It's like, oh, money won't solve your problems and all that kind of stuff. But I do think that talking to a lot of my friends, because obviously being from Fort McMurray, I have a large number of very wealthy friends that make a lot of money working in the oil sands. And I obviously think I do okay kind of doing the podcast here and teaching. But it's definitely it's not the same world. I'm definitely not in the making of $200,000 and $300,000 per year as a lot of my friends are. But I do find it interesting in reference to Amy Marshall's episode where like we talked about trying to accomplish like this steady level of joy that we are always trying to manifest for ourselves in our daily lives. And I know that sounds almost like a cheesy mental health thing, but it is interesting like how many people that are close to me often say how miserable they are in these kind of high paying jobs. And the only thing I'm really trying to get at here is realistically, why should someone move into education? Why should people be teachers? And how do we retain teachers? I did kind of say that teaching is very good at pretty much making sure you won't really be in need of anything with the salary that you will get. I think so. In New Brunswick, for example, one of the things that I'm not sure if I have voiced, is when I moved here, I was like, okay, like every place has a salary grid, and one of theirs changed recently in their collective agreement, and to the best of my knowledge, it goes like A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I. I think it goes up to 11 letters overall, where I was like, okay, so I'm in like my fourth year of teaching now, like on the scale, because my sub experience didn't apply. Anyway, long story short, but I was one step lower on the grid. And I was like, this doesn't make any sense. And I kind of went through, had a lot of conversations with people at the MBTA of like, hey, like this doesn't really make sense. Like I should be on like step 3, but I'm actually on step 2. And they had actually written in their agreement that when you are a teacher and as soon as you graduate, you stay on step A for 2 full years until you go to step B. So it kind of like added a year to the letter. So instead of using numbers, they actually keep you as certain letters for more years. And as far as I know, that's only the case with step A. Now, first off, being an outsider, this made no sense to me. How you expect someone who's 23 to 25, obviously you're younger, you don't most likely you're kind of creating that to go toward the most average person. And even though we kind of know the myth of average and the myth of normal, that pretty much no one is average or normal. So the idea I think here is that people who are younger do not need quite as much money, which I guess in theory does make sense if they do not have 2 or 3 children or dependents, which I do understand. But they also have student loans, potentially weddings, and saving for down payments in a market that's not very favorable. But anyway, my idea there was it'll still kind of accomplish your basic needs. And if you want to go into teaching, you can't really go into it, I think, as it has always been, even though it's actually arguably a solid salary almost anywhere in Canada relative to pretty much anywhere else where there are teaching jobs available. I thought that the idea of like freezing teachers at so you from your first day of teaching to your 364th day of teaching, you would make that step A salary. And then that next, then you finally go to step 2 once you're actually starting your 3rd year. So anyway, that was so once you're at like 2 years and 1 day, that's when you start. Now I have been hearing that this is a pretty common criticism. Even teachers who like voted on the agreement for something to fix for the next one. But I always just kind of found that interesting of going into like what do you want out of life and like how much money do you need, I guess, to be satisfied and content, and how much do you value your time over what you make, especially not just in the early phase of your career but as you kind of move throughout with Amy. So yeah, that's kind of my whole little tangent there on step A for the collective agreement. But I would argue for retention you should almost kind of chop those first 3 years out, kind of start everyone where a normal 4th year teacher would start now, which would be like average kind of 4-year degree, start around the 80,000 Canadian mark, and then still kind of max out at the same rate. But again, I might make a video on that exact idea that I would have, which would not necessarily be at more of a cost to the taxpayer, because I mean the cost of turnover and retraining teachers in the same district is also very expensive. So that can be a conversation for another day. With Amy Marshall as well, like we talked about smooth joy. It was hilarious because like when it came to the money question, there's a quote from I think comedian Brian Callen, and he said he's like a multimillionaire comedian, and I used to watch him on How I Met Your Mother, and he said, you know what? After making millions of dollars, which I assume he has, and I think he has, he said, none of it really matters or makes a difference once you get past the point of when you go to a restaurant, you can eat whatever you want. And Amy kind of had a hilarious reflection on that. And she said, realistically, I just want my children to experience the taste of grapes. So I think for her and I, pretty much a similar philosophy. Again, we're not going to be traveling overseas 8 times a year and staying at the fanciest of places, but finding the more simpler things and kind of living a more smooth and calm and regulated existence seems to kind of be what most teachers are chasing after. And I do kind of get the sense that most teachers stress quite heavily about money, almost like until they are in the past year 6 on any particular pay scale. That's it. Anyway, that seems to be the case so far. We did have some conversations because I would say that our American counterparts arguably make 25% less than Canadian teachers would. So that's kind of its own thing for maybe potentially another day. Maybe I'll do like a teacher pay scale comparison episode, and I'll kind of put in my ideas of like what the actual cost would be to raise it at the earlier stages and kind of keep it more consistent to help actually retain your teachers, not say, okay, come into the most intense 3 years of your teaching life, which is arguably your first three, and we're actually not even going to give you a raise in those 3 years. So anyway, that's kind of a crazy concept, I think. But anyway, that's to be determined. I'll create an episode on that. I think that could be fun. And so the next one was with Aaron Schreier. And Dr. Aaron Schreier is someone who I came across here in St. John as as people that I know have children that go to Origins Natural Learning Childcare Learning Care. Obviously, I'm hoping to potentially send my own children there as well, just because kind of word of mouth and all that stuff. But a very interesting conversation about trying to expand the definition of what private education is. I do think whenever it comes to private education, my first main thought is, okay, what does more money in education allow you to do? Because the first main thing would be, you know what? They're going to trim class sizes in half by having students pay between $10 and $25 or $30,000 a year by creating more opportunity. Because I do think that on average, like if you pay for private school, it'll be 15 to 20,000 for anyone who's kind of in a middle school to high school level, and that is actually like pretty close to what the government pays per student on average in Canada if you don't go to a private schools. I do know that private schools kind of get some funding if they kind of commit to using the New Brunswick curriculum, but what I found fascinating in our conversation was even students that go through a private system will eventually get, like, they won't, just because you go into private school does not mean that you will actually reach a superior reading or numeracy assessment level by the time you've completed it, which I thought was actually a refreshing admission by her, that like they deal with the same research hurdles and issues, but I do feel that what you might get is honestly a more tight-knit professional learning community, because those, and this is kind of me just speculating, I think, where she said that she mainly goes to hire international teachers because her school actually goes year round. So there's a lot more flexibility, I think, in the way the general yearly schedule goes. And she also mentioned that they do a lot of emphasis on outdoor education, which I think I would love to explore more in that regard of how to get kids outside more, because that pretty much seems to be, especially with the future of education online, I've been seeing that a lot of schools in the US have these like 2 to 3 hour like AI tutoring days where the students actually don't have a specific teacher in the room. They actually have their own personalized AI tutor. And then the other 2 to 4 hours per day that they spend at school is strictly outdoor. It's play based, even in like middle and high school, and social emotional learning. So it's not actually just that they have the same kind of academic schedule all day, every day, and that those things are sprinkled in. It's actually dedicated in massive chunks, which is obviously easier when you have a one room school. But it just seems to be that everything that private schools are doing is things that we could be doing in a public school classroom, but we're just too afraid to be judged by other teachers in doing so. And I think that's something that will need to change if we want to continue to find ways to keep all of our students regulated and our teachers regulated, I think, because I think if I had an extra hour to hour and a half outside that was productive and educational, I think everyone could benefit from that, especially when with the 4 to 5 months per year in Canada, you could probably get away with that. I think that the first one that kind of sticks with me is that if you wanted to include more outdoor learning in your math class, you could actually, instead of using like your counters, take them outside and they can find rocks to do kind of like what's 3 groups of 6 for 3 times 6, and they actually have rocks and they're finding things. So you're kind of actively using the materials around you to contribute to some outdoor learning, which I actually thought was very, very interesting, of just a way to reframe pretty much what you're always doing in your classroom, but you can actually get students involved. I know there's a beach right by my class or right by my school, so I think there could always be ways to potentially break that in while we continue to try and enhance some of these things. So another thing that's kind of come up a lot for me recently is the Midwit trap. I don't know if anyone else has, if I'm late to the game here, I don't really know exactly how it took me so long to come across this meme. But it's pretty much, it speaks to the idea that the longer you're doing something and the more engaged you are in any sort of academic subject, the simpler you make your explanations for everything. It almost seems that some people who are kind of insecure in their knowledge on a particular subject will actually lean heavily on jargon to help themselves sound more intelligent, but it actually might speak to a legitimate lower level of understanding, but they're just trying to mask the fact that they do not know quite as much. I've even said myself this year, I have a lot of very fancy ways that I can kind of explain the job that I do, which is like a new piloted role, but the actual day-to-day kind of not even surviving it, but just trying to figure out the flexibility but still be productive is its own kind of game. But anyway, the midwit trap was pretty much like people who have actually no idea about a subject, people who have like the PhD level knowledge will actually end up saying the very simple thing. And it's those kind of dealing with the middle that are actually in, it's not that they are making the mistake and not doing a good way of showing what they have learned. It's just that they've only learned a little bit, but they kind of overcomplicate it to make it sound like they've learned a lot. I would say this might actually be one of the reasons why a lot of people think that they don't learn very much in education in university, because it's, I would say that the professors almost have learned that it's like easier to keep it simple than to overcomplicate it, but that can also come back as a, you know, like, I'm paying for this education, so I would like to actually go and be able to kind of carry that jargon conversation, even if it wasn't even particularly beneficial. For kind of the cool things that I've been involved in with my own school here lately, I do think that there's a common thread in education, and I would love to hear your stories about this if you have experienced something similar. Where again, students, if you're listening, whenever, let's just say I'm new to teaching math this year, and there's people that have taught for 15 years, I go have a conversation with that person. For the most part, a lot of teachers will be like, oh yeah, this is what I do. Here's everything you need. Don't think twice about it. That speaks to me as a healthy culture of, like, I'm not going to do this for you, obviously, but I understand that struggle of kind of needing to prepare new things for every single day. I remember when I was doing my practicum, there was a teacher who was just very frantic every day, said that they were like making new worksheets, and this is obviously before Magic School AI, but any sort of worksheet that you're working on, they would rewrite from scratch. And even before the Magic School AI stuff came out, that was just not necessarily needed because there was just Google Drives filled with things, especially during COVID when every teacher was kind of forced to put their cabinets full of material online for them to use. But I do think that I've been part of a really cool team this year in the sense of we are all still somewhat earlier in our career. The kind of hierarchy of coaching in the New Brunswick system, I think, is innovative beyond anything that I've ever seen or even heard of. Obviously, I'm only acquainted with two kind of major systems myself personally, but I have not heard of this level of depth in coaching before. I've probably talked about it before, but actually, so Amy Marshall, she would be like our literacy lead for our district for 6 to 12, potentially even the full thing. I'm not exactly sure. But even like beneath her, kind of in the hierarchy, we have 6 to 12 literacy coaches as well. So there's kind of like this huge team and hierarchy of people in a specific subject that you're able to kind of, I guess, for a lack of a better term, like rent out for the day. And they can come to your school and help plan lessons. These are very experienced teachers, obviously, in their field. And I think when you have a newer community of teachers that you're going to feel a lot more willing to accept help because there's so much you need help with of just trying to find this balance of I don't need to teach everything in the curriculum tomorrow and try to jam it all into one lesson every single day. And also making sure like you kind of need to learn to be okay with looking at this massive curriculum and saying, I don't need to worry about 2/3 of this for another 3 months. Meaning you're actually taking the time to say, you know what? I know this has to be covered all year, which can feel daunting, but being able to actually sit back, focus on a certain set of outcomes, and actually plan specifically for them. And so our group has kind of taken a week by week position where we each kind of put our best foot forward. We kind of put together our best kind of group of 5 lesson plans for like the first week, and then we each plan a week. So I mean, by the time you do this 5 times in a year, you're going to have 30 weeks of lessons already prepared for you for that subject for an entire school year. And really, you've only planned 25 lessons, and you get a full year's worth of lessons that you're kind of exchanging the best ideas with everyone around you. And you're doing that while working with a coach. So I think that has been really cool to be a part of. And I think that and the only reason I even bring that up is because there's a lot oftentimes where teachers will not be willing to share and they'll be kind of weird about it. And I think a lot of teachers where are once you kind of get past the year 5, like 7 through 10, like you kind of have a pretty good rhythm going. I would say even after like year 25, obviously everyone's going to become set in their ways as they continue to move forward in their career in any domain. But it's interesting hearing stories about how resistant some people are to having anyone come in that could potentially change what it is they're doing, and they almost take it as a threat. I think obviously you can go down the rabbit hole of being cheesy about growth mindset and all those things whenever you want, but I think no matter who you are, there's always something you can learn from anyone. So that's kind of my mindset there of if your culture is not collaborating and willfully sharing all your documents. Like I've even had teachers share drives with me when I've looked at it, and it's probably easy like $100 to $200 worth of teachers pay teacher stuff in there. Obviously that's stuff that they've used their own income for that they're still willing to share openly. So I do think that there is a lot more room for that as well. One thing that I found interesting, if you look up the Anglophone South School District, is they actually recently talked about moving to a 4-day instructional week. This was kind of brought to us in a big vote, and it needed to have like 100% of teachers on board to make the change. And as far as I know, there's quite a few news articles about this, so it's not like a private thing. It has been shut down, but trying to move into this new phase of allowing teachers to actually have some flexibility and PL and time and making planning time, report card time, marking time as actual part of our 5-day work week rather than kind of giving you the vague 32 hours of instructional time per week, and then you kind of figure out a way to plan and mark around that. Yeah, it's been something I think is definitely worthy of checking out. And I guess before I go too long here, who I've got coming up is Robert Barnett, and then he's kind of the main one for the next episode. Robert is actually the founder of the Modern Classrooms Project and is a Harvard Law graduate. Absolutely brilliant guy. But I encourage you to check him out in his episode this week because it pretty much falls in this entire new domain, similar to the idea of outdoor learning and finding different methods where every single student, no matter what, should be able to work at their own pace. And there's a lot of ways for teachers to figure out a way to do that. Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. If you have not yet, please leave me a review on Apple, Spotify, and shoot me your questions, topics you'd like me to talk about, and have another great month. See you today.